friends. I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor, and today this isn't so much of a session for tutelage as kind of me showing off my resume a little bit so that you can kind of understand where I come from as far as my gaming background and experience. By showing you my collection, I show you a little bit about my understanding of the game and the experiences that I've had. The game that I'm about to show you is probably the one that I've played more than any other. Although, as a forever DM, I don't get a lot of time to play, so this one is kind of special to me because it's got a lot of fond memories wrapped up in my time as a player, mostly back in my college days, so quite a while ago. But this is 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons. Now, this isn't the first book I've ever had of 2nd edition D&D. Those were lost at various times. This is a reprinted version. The first one I thought had cooler art, but this is what they eventually went with, and it's fine. It's fine. It does everything just fine. A couple of the major differences from basic Dungeons and Dragons. Number one, the books are thicker. There are a lot more rules that are more concretely expressed in these versions than the advanced Dungeons and Dragons. This is because this was an attempt to kind of codify the experience of Dungeons and Dragons, make it less subjective, more of a streamlined approach so that everybody's playing kind of the same version of Dungeons and Dragons. Still is imaginative, still lots of classes and choices for people, but this one took a bit of a different approach than Dungeons and Dragons originally did. This was when, I believe, TSR, the company behind Dungeons & Dragons, went a little cuckoo with putting out stuff for the express purpose of turning profit. And this was, of course, the system that they ended up going out of business with. So, the basic player's handbook, of course, absolutely necessary if you're going to play 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons. It has all the rules for creating characters, all the spells, items, and equipment. And again, everything is thrown at you at once. There isn't any step-by-step up. It has all the information for characters from 1st level on up to 25th, and notes that 25th is not the end. You can continue to progress beyond that if you wanted to. If you wanted to play a forever game that never ended, you could keep doing that and your characters could climb higher than 25th level. However, when you do that, your characters will outstrip the boundaries of basic characters, even though the progression is pretty minute. You don't get vastly greater powers, unless, of course, you're a spellcaster. After you hit a certain point, your power levels off rather drastically. So if you're playing a fighter of some sort or a thief of some sort, your power level tails off drastically while the wizards are getting into the universe-shattering powers. It's kind of a strange dynamic, but it's one that we've always kind of accepted while playing Dungeons and Dragons. Eventually, the spellcasters are going to rule the entire thing. Along with the player's handbook, of course, you need the Dungeon Master's handbook. And the Dungeon Master's Guide in this was basically very similar to the Dungeon Master's Guide. It just was cleaned up so that it makes more sense, it flows, and the tables aren't quite as random with every little thing just kind of thrown in a potpourri of dungeon mastering. This one, it has it broken down. This is about combat and how it works with well fleshed out illustrations, and there was a conscious decision not to be as wordy as the 1st edition was, so that people could digest it easier, and made it much simpler to get into Dungeons & Dragons by the time 2nd edition rolled around. Also, the art improved drastically. So, some of the art in the books of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons are kind of, chuckle-worthy. Some of the artists, like Erlotis, they made art that was kind of almost more fitting for cartoon strips, but it was part of the charm of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. 2nd edition left that behind for eye appeal. These books have art that is very pretty. And again, this is a polished version of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So everything is a lot smoother. Also, a lot more has been laid onto the player's hands. Now players can, again, not have to rely on the game master telling them if they hit or not. They can actually figure out the armor class they hit with a little tool called THAC0, which stands for 2-Hit Armor Class 0. If you know the armor class that you hit when you roll relative to what 0 is for what you roll and how good your character is, you can then just tell the game master what you hit, whether or not they have additional penalties or bonuses in their head based on what's going on. You might not know, but at least it gives you some control over the information that goes to the game master. Some people didn't like that as much, clearly. There's always a rift whenever you go from different editions, but it was quite a difference, and I found it to be a very nice system, one that I told many great stories with. So, of course, you've got those books. There demands that there's a third book, of course. Let me introduce you to the Monstrous Compendium. This was both a genius idea and a horrible, horrible mistake. All wrapped up in one. First of all, this is a binder. And it is full of pages which are different monster entries. Every one of these pages is at least a monster entry. It might be two if it's front, because they're front and back. And they had several different volumes. The very first volume came with the set. Then you would have the next set, and they would all come in tabs, and you could just put them in alphabetical order and eventually fill out a pretty good selection of all the different monsters. Most of them coming from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. They just updated them into the second edition. And these monster stat blocks became very familiar to me. All the classic monsters are here. And again, you had multiple of these editions. I think there were a total of 3 for the core set, and then after that they had them expanded based on different worlds. For instance, there was a Ravenloft set, there was a Planescape set. Sometimes they came with a box set for a campaign world, so that you would have the monsters that were custom to that particular world. And there were a variety of those too. I couldn't tell you right now all of the different compendium editions, but I said this was a brilliant idea, and I stand by that, because you can take the monsters you're going to use in an encounter, open up your binder, take out the pages, and you don't have to lug this thing all over the place. Just put them in something where the pages aren't going to get too wrinkled or messed up, and you can put them right back when you're done, and great. The problem was they were just hole-punched sheets of paper, and those would tear, especially because the binding prongs didn't meet perfectly. So when you would flip the pages back and forth, they would catch on that joint and they would tear a little bit. Just a tiny little bit, but after time, they would practically be falling apart. Now, smart people would go through and they would get those circular hole protectors for every single page. I did not do that. So as a result, my binder isn't in wonderful shape. But I learned not to rely on this binder too terribly, and I rejoiced, as I suspect several people did, when they finally came out with a Monstrous Manual. Now this is, again, kind of the definitive for the monsters of the Dungeons & Dragons world for 2nd edition. The art was a bit all over the place. I did not like a lot of the art because they leaned on some artists whose styles I don't care for very much. Some of their art was pretty bland, but some of it, there's an artist or two that really, I just didn't care for their art. So there's a number of them that I really don't like. But as far as giving you a lot of information about individual monsters, their general diets, their lifespan, what they do, was spelled out quite well for each entry and each monster, so that they gave the Dungeon Master a lot of tools to make those monsters live and breathe and give them purpose and direction. Something that you didn't get a lot of in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So they really learned how to gate out information better to the people who were running their games. And that came in a couple different printings. I have 2 of them because just how they came to me. So then, another book that I consider extremely important for 2nd edition was the Tome of Magic. Not that the magics were lacking from the player's handbook, but this almost felt like it doubled the amount of spells, and some incredibly useful magics were in this book. So since I love playing spellcasters, I wanted this book for 2nd edition. And most of the stuff is pretty well balanced within this power structure of Dungeons and Dragons. You don't find too many spells that are just, yeah, you'd be stupid not to take the spell because it's so good. A lot of them are, I'll get the spell because it makes sense to the idiom of my character, and that's kind of what ruled a lot of my decisions. Now, in addition, there were a couple of very notable source books that added on. There were a lot of box sets, world books, and stuff like that. Rather than a book of just Greyhawk Adventures, there were 2 box sets for Greyhawk altogether. But I do find that I found this book really handy, the Forgotten Realms Demi-Human Deities book, because honestly, the Forgotten Realms kind of became the default for the various demi-human gods. I believe this was all drafted out of a Dragon Magazine article, but this one describes the various gods of demi-humans, gives them a name, a face, a little bit of history to them, some things about their avatar, most importantly, things about their priesthoods and their holy days, which I find to be so useful for engaging the imagination of what it's like to be a part of the clergy or even the laity of these faiths. Something that's often just taken for granted by games, but I find it to be very important. If somebody is playing a religious person, that probably has a profound impact on their life, especially if their faith is so great that the deity chooses to channel their power through that servant. So I find that to be an excellent resource, even better than the Deities and Demigods book for 2nd edition, which I don't own, by the way. Did not choose to get that one. But a couple other things that are very important to the understanding of what exactly 2nd edition was like were the handbooks. Yeah, these maroon handbooks. These really kind of broke 2nd edition, to be honest with you. I don't know how well the playtesting went with a lot of this stuff, but some of these books really did a great job of giving you insights onto what it was like to be some of these classes, or alternate ideas that you could have on how to run some of the various classes available in the game. And some of them were fairly generalized. I'm still looking for the Complete Wizards book, because that was one of my favorites. Again, I love playing Wizards. But I have this mostly as an example of what these books were even like. I don't have the complete collection of them, and if I get any more, it'll just be because it's a target of opportunity more so than anything I really need. But these books gave you 2 major things. Massive amounts of lore, background, equipment, gear, magics in some cases for the different classes. That was all gravy if you were going to be playing in a class and you had these handbooks. They were really useful for that. It had some really interesting ideas, not all of which had a game mechanic to them. Some of them were just nice background. But the thing many of them also had were kits, which later eventually became expanded into prestige classes in 3rd edition. The idea that you're playing a class, but instead of your focus being just kind of the general experience for that class, instead you really narrowed your focus and picked up some new abilities while leaving some abilities that you didn't find so important behind. And I'm not going to go into great detail on that, because that's not what this purpose of this video is, but some of them really were kind of broken. Getting rid of things that made a class balanced and sharpening them to the point that if you cared about one thing more than anything else, you'd be a fool not to take a particular kit. Some of them were just broken, in my opinion. A lot of people consider some of these books to be really, really a problem. I found the Wizard book to be pretty well balanced all in all, but some of them we found were just either difficult to include in a party and not have that character overshadow the other characters, or sometimes just do things that were really, that just made the game more complicated. So I'm not going to go again into details, but that was an important thing. Another thing that was kind of a big deal in second edition D&D, the book on humanoids. There was more of an effort to try to include other races that people were interested in playing as. You wanted to play a goblin? This was the book for you. If you wanted to be a bugbear or an orc or a gnoll, this would explain how to balance the ability to play as a player character with all the inherent background savagery and sometimes barbarianism that the races are known for, and how to play somebody who's aberrant and actually looks to improve their lot and character. So I actually have 2 copies of that because, again, I bought out a lot and one of those came with it. But I think it's a very important book for second edition to understand that shift of, I want to play a character who's a Minotaur. I think that's really cool. Yeah, some people will do it because they want horns, they want extra strength. But some people are like, I really want to walk around in the hooves of a Minotaur and see what life is like and try to... well, they don't have hooves, they have feet, but you get the idea. The other one I got, this is mostly in honor of a friend who played with us and really, really loved the concept, the Complete Psionics Handbook. Psionics were actually in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons in a supplement or supplementary role in the back appendixes. It was a hodgepodge thing that was just kind of thrown in. Most characters never really even had a chance at psionics, and if you did, you never had a great chance. But if you had it, it was another level of power that you'd have access to. It also could be a profound pain in the butt because psychic enemies suddenly became another level of threat to you that you might have to deal with. But mostly you enjoyed having extra powers and cool abilities. This allowed you to make that a profession. You could play a psionic character, and this wasn't just the half-thought-out hodgepodge idea that was crammed into an appendix in the player's handbook. It's still broken. It's still not a very comfortable part of the game. But with this, you could play a character whose focus is purely on the psionics and play them as kind of an alternate caster. Although they generally tended on things that weren't overtly magical and oftentimes more inherently based on their own bodies. But not always. So I have that. And then to represent the second half, what basically was second 2.5 edition, which was a thing, even if we didn't acknowledge it at the time, like they did with third edition, these 2 books, the player option books they came up with. These really let you tinker under the hood of the rules of Dungeons & Dragons. In some cases, allowed you to do things that were... Some people just really started talking about min-maxing in these books, where you could literally take things that you just took for granted, like strength. I have high strength. Well, what happens if I don't have the top strength? What I could do is I can split that strength so that I could do damage as if I'm much stronger, but all of a sudden another element of strength is weakened. And I can split things up like that. That's just an example. But these gave characters new levels of power, and if you optimize the character using these abilities, your characters could go off the charts of what is normally expected for the power curve of the various characters. And I have these, again, largely for instructive purposes, not that I really use them that much. By those dying days of second edition, we were still not really using these hardly at all. We looked at them and we kind of laughed at them, honestly. But it is, I think, important to understand that Dungeons & Dragons at second edition really was focused on appealing to a lot of people, and part of that included getting them to continue buy things from them. So they keep making these kind of books and just made them in such quantities that they eventually choked on their own game. This was a deliberate attempt saying, our rules can be broken, they can be very flexible. If you want to play out your power fantasy and have even stronger characters, here you go. And then they eventually went bankrupt. So that is a selection of the various books that I have. Do I ever plan on playing second edition again? Someday I might, but it's not going to include everything that was ever available for second edition. I find that playing a nice tight game using the core rules would work just fine for a limited scope. And as far as a longer campaign, I'm not sure. I've kind of moved on over the years. I'm not afraid of it. I would certainly love to play in another second edition game, and I wouldn't mind running a short campaign or a one-off possibly in second edition. Absolutely. It was a fine game system. Do I love it enough to devote an entire long campaign to it, though? That's the question, and that's one that really I've stepped back from that abyss. I honestly don't think, though, that the core game is really even the most important thing about second edition Dungeons & Dragons. Yes, it's important to understand how the game has evolved and how it's changed. And these books are certainly a core part of it. But I believe that it's the worlds that Dungeons & Dragons inspired. The box sets that they came out with. Dark Sun, Ravenloft, Planescape, Forgotten Realms, Greyhawk. Those are just the major ones that come to mind, and there were other ones as well. I'm not deliberately shorting anybody on this one. If you had your own game system in the box sets and you really loved them, I'm sure you're familiar with your worlds and you had great things to do. But these were some of the best realized worlds and cities and experiences in role-playing games in general. A couple places got known for a particular city or something, but because so many people play Dungeons & Dragons, those experiences became shared common experiences that a lot of people could speak, almost like another language. And other people could then understand their experiences and share stories about that time they were in the Green Dragon Inn together or the Black Dragon Inn in Greyhawk. And maybe took a shot at some of the most infamous dungeons in history. The Quest of the Rod of Seven Parts, for instance. Was all something that you could possibly do. Even the cool thing about second edition too was that transporting things from advanced Dungeons and Dragons wasn't terribly difficult. So you could still run your Tomb of Horrors, your Against the Giants campaigns in second edition just fine. The balance wasn't drastically different, so porting things wasn't terribly difficult. That's going to change in the next edition. And that might have to be broken up into two, because I have a lot of third edition books. I have run a lot of third edition after all, and I grabbed books as they became available and were useful. A couple of them to fill out the collection too. Maybe not have as many of the third-party books as were available. I concentrated mostly on the ones Wizards of the Coast were putting out, but the quality was quite good on many of them. Not all. We'll discuss that later. But this is what I have for second, minus the source books, minus the box sets, minus the modules, just the core rules as I remember them. Some of them from what I played, but mostly from ones that I've recollected, trying to recapture the experience back from second edition. So hopefully these may spark some imagination in you. That's something you're interested in, you want to hear more about. Or maybe these are something that you remember from your past and you would love to hear stories, reliving some of those times. I could certainly oblige you on that. Just leave something in the comments below, and I'll be glad to focus on one of these in future videos and maybe give you more details if this is something that excites you or interests you. But yeah, next one in the ongoing resume of the Dungeon Tutor, we're going to talk about a time that was very important in the gaming history. The start of a new millennium in the year 2000, third edition Dungeons & Dragons. So we'll get to that next. So hopefully you enjoyed this. Come back again for more, and we will show you more of the collections and various books and their importance, and mostly, again, to show you some of the things that we can talk about. So, thank you very much. I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. Until next time, this closes out this session. Thank you, and farewell.